The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 56 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Between 1754 and 1763, North Americans participated in the French and Indian War. But did you know that as this World War raged, many South Carolinians, Virginians, Britons, and Cherokee people also fought a war for land, trade, and respect? Today we embark on an exploration of the Anglo-Cherokee War with Daniel Tortora, author of Carolina in Crisis: Cherokees, Colonists, and Slaves in the American Southeast. During our investigation, Daniel reveals what Cherokee and Anglo-American society looked like prior to the French and Indian War, what caused the Anglo-Cherokee War, and how the British and Cherokee peoples negotiated peace. Are you ready to discover more about this understudied aspect of early American and Native American history? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an historian of the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. He enjoys researching topics that shed light on the overlooked experiences of Native American peoples. He is an assistant professor of history at Colby College and the author of 2 books, Fort Halifax, Winslow's Historic Outpost, and, most recently, Carolina in Crisis: Cherokees, Colonists, and Slaves in the American Southeast. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Daniel Tortora.
Thanks for having me.
Daniel, the Anglo-Cherokee War, which is the subject of your book, Carolina in Crisis, is not necessarily a mainstream topic. So would you provide us a brief overview of the Anglo-Cherokee War and tell us when it took place and whether there were any pivotal battles that we might know about?
Sure. The Anglo-Cherokee War spun off of the French and Indian War fought further to the north. In 1758, Cherokee warriors were returning home from a British expedition against Fort Duquesne, which is today Pittsburgh, and they were attacked and killed by Virginia frontiersmen. Over the next year, Cherokees retaliated, launching attacks on the southern frontiers. And in 1759, 1760, and 1761, there were 3 separate military expeditions launched by South Carolina and or British forces. All during these 3 years, there were skirmishes and battles fought on the southern frontiers, and in particular, the ones that come to mind, there was a hostage crisis in 1760 at Fort Prince George, which is in upstate South Carolina. There was in that year also, the Cherokees captured Fort Loudon and defeated a British army in western North Carolina. Fort Loudon was in Tennessee. And the third expedition, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Grant, was a British victory and ultimately resulted in the destruction of 1,500 acres of Cherokee village fields and destroyed about half of Cherokee villages. So it really had a devastating impact as well.
The war takes place between 1759 and 1761. That's most of the French and Indian War as it takes place here in North America. Can we consider the Anglo-Cherokee War and its battles as part of the French and Indian War, or do we need to look at this as a separate event?
I really think we should consider it as part of the French and Indian War. It's one that doesn't get a lot of coverage in the existing books on the French and Indian War, but it's one that certainly closely relates to it, and I think that my work shines light on the Southern theater, or what was going on in the South during those years, and many people are not aware that there was so much drama and conflict and excitement.
I'm one of those people that didn't know that there was so much drama and excitement. I mean, when I think of the French and Indian War, I think Fort Ticonderoga, Oswego, Crown Point, Quebec, Montreal. I didn't think of South Carolina.
And I think in particular, the fall of Fort Loudon in 1760 is just one of the remarkable and little-known events that so many people in New England don't know. I grew up in Connecticut, and I had toured and traveled and been to Fort Number 4 and some of the places on the northern frontier, but I had never known before I was really in graduate school that anything had even happened to the South.
It seems to me that if we're going to understand the Anglo-Cherokee War and its causes, we should really look at Anglo and Cherokee society just before the French and Indian War. So let's begin with Cherokee society. Daniel, what did Cherokee society look like prior to 1754?
Well, there were about 10 to 12,000 Cherokees living in about 40 or 50 villages. These were organized along rivers and organized into about 5 clusters. One of those was in upstate South Carolina. One of those was in what is today Franklin County, North Carolina. One was near modern Cherokee, North Carolina. Another was in the area just outside of Knoxville in Monroe County, Tennessee. And finally, the 5th was to the east of that and along the southern Tennessee to Georgia border.
Are the Cherokees one people or are they many people?
Well, they're really one people. I would argue that they're decentralized in their political leadership, and they would come together during times of crisis, especially during this war. But their settlement clusters really made them pursue different foreign policy, different relations with other Indian tribes, different degrees of contact with English or French traders and governments. So they were one culturally, but they were often separate politically and in terms of how they related to the outside world.
Were they an agrarian society, a hunter society? What do the Cherokee produce for trade goods?
This is a matrilineal society where women's voice mattered and was respected, but these Cherokees were primarily living from hunting, deer in particular, hunting and fishing, and yes, so you could consider it an agrarian society, but increasingly from the late 1600s to the late 1700s, they became sucked into the deerskin trade to the point that they were hunting for deer skins, producing the skins in exchange for English trade goods, and that really transformed their lives as well, and that made them in some ways different than how they had been before European contact.
When they get sucked into the deer trade, are there villages moving as well, or is it just the hunters going out to collect the deer skins?
Well, it was just the hunters going out during these years, but they certainly had a lot more work to do. When life revolved around the deerskin trade, women had more work processing the deer skins, and they were in debt at times, and so that created tensions with traders because the traders would bring them goods and advance them credit, and so that often made tensions between the different parties. So in that sense, it definitely shaped their lives, but I don't think it really led to a reshuffling of villages or settlements, but it certainly made them more dependent on English and to some extent French traders.
So we're really looking at a matrilineal society that is sedentary. They have these villages that are established. They farm them. Their hunters go out and hunt deer skins to help trade for the goods that they need from or want from the English people.
Right. That would be to get jewelry, clothing, guns, knives, hatchets, kettles, and stockings and other items. To some extent, there was also a small trade of agricultural products between the two sides. Cherokees eventually adopted chickens and other animals, but for the most part, the deerskin trade was the main economic relationship between the two. And the deerskin trade was so important to the Southeast that it was the second biggest export at that time in the 1750s, second only to rice.
In fact, in your book, Carolina in Crisis, you mentioned that Virginia and South Carolina both wanted the Cherokee trade and the deerskins that they were collecting.
They did, and Virginia and South Carolina traders and governments were competing for the affections of the Cherokees, and they were competing for the deer hides as well. And when the French and Indian War began, both South Carolina and Virginia rushed to construct a fort in the Cherokee country, and in fact, each constructed their own. The Virginia fort was not very impressive, and it actually soon collapsed or probably fell into ruin. The South Carolina fort, which South Carolina would garrison for the next about 4 years, that's Fort Loudon in present-day Von Orr, Tennessee. And you can actually visit the reconstructed fort today. But South Carolina ultimately prevailed because they had the longer relationship with the Cherokees going back further in time. But Virginia and South Carolina would compete and continue to compete for Cherokee military aid, for Cherokee economic assistance throughout the French and Indian War, really until Cherokees and South Carolina and Virginia and so forth began to clash.
Where does North Carolina fit in this mix? Because in between Virginia and South Carolina is North Carolina.
Yeah, North Carolina is a thread that runs through my book. North Carolina didn't have much of a relationship with the Cherokee Indians during these years. They didn't really have the political stability that the other colonies had, and they didn't have the money. So they couldn't really pursue very much as a government with the Cherokees. Although Cherokee villages were located in what is today North Carolina and what was, I guess, then considered part of North Carolina, there wasn't much that they could offer. And their governor and their troops really didn't offer very much either. They had tried. Their main fort at that time was at Fort Dobbs in Statesville, North Carolina today. And they had tried to participate in each of the expeditions that I had mentioned a little while ago to Cherokee country during the war, and each year some disaster occurred. So they really weren't able to do very much throughout the war years, although they did try, and that's a thread that you can read about.
Now that we have a good understanding of what Cherokee society looked like, what kind of trade they're conducting with Virginia and South Carolina, let's take a look at Anglo society in South Carolina. What did South Carolinian society look like in 1754?
Well, South Carolina life seemed to center around Charleston, a seaport town with great extremes of wealth and poverty, located where it is today. And there were also several other coastal settlements, all of them with a planter class that was also the ruling class. Along the frontiers of South Carolina, there were pockets of settlers. Some of them were German or Scots-Irish immigrants. Many of them were poor. And of course, there was a large enslaved population, especially in the coastal regions, but also tending the crops and corn and wheat fields of the frontier.
I recall from my readings on Southern life that disease ran rampant in the swamp waters of South Carolina during the summer. Did that sort of disease affect Cherokee society as well?
Well, Cherokees were definitely affected by disease. They were affected and shaped especially by smallpox. And in 1738, a major smallpox epidemic struck Cherokee country. It wounded for life one of their principal leaders and one of their most important warriors, a Conestoga, who plays a prominent role in my book. He bore the marks of smallpox for the rest of his life. In 1760, another epidemic also hit Cherokee country. And beyond that, other smaller Indian tribes like the Catawba Indians, who live just south of Charlotte today, they were also severely affected by smallpox and other diseases. So absolutely. And the smallpox in particular was something that all groups, Indian, African Americans, and whites, had to contend with during the colonial period.
It seems like even though Cherokee and South Carolinian society are different, they do share a lot in common. They share a trade. They share a susceptibility to disease. Do they also share an interest in slavery? Did the Cherokee practice slavery?
Well, the Cherokees had a form of slavery, but it was certainly nothing like what South Carolina had. Later in the 1800s, Cherokees would adopt slavery, probably because their lives began to more closely resemble that of white people. But they didn't really have slavery like South Carolina. And in fact, there were concerns, or South Carolinians had concerns, that slaves might escape to Cherokee country. And that was a concern that dated back pretty far to at least 1730 or earlier. So Cherokees had slavery, but it was nothing like what slavery looked like in the Anglo world. And many slaves became, or eventually became, full-fledged members of Cherokee society. So it was certainly not an inherited, brutal kind of thing. It was a means to an end in many cases, most cases.
Another aspect that Cherokee and South Carolinian society had in common was they both participated in the French and Indian War. Would you tell us about Cherokee war culture and the function of war in Cherokee society?
Sure. One European observer said that their primary ambition in life is to distinguish themselves through war. And indeed, Cherokees saw war as the path to social and political status. It was something that all men did. It was something that was never taken lightly. Sometimes Cherokees went to war to avenge the death of members killed by other tribes. Sometimes they went to war in the 1750s, for example, as British allies to try to attack their enemies with British help, to try to distinguish themselves and gain the status that I mentioned. So Cherokees saw war as really an important and a constant part of life. Their attitudes towards war were a little different, though, in that they always sought to minimize casualties. And so whenever it looked like they were going to be routed, rather than sacrifice additional lives, they would simply withdraw. In many cases, if they felt spiritually or that they were getting a bad message or bad vibe, if you will, from their conjurers, their leaders, spiritual leaders, or through their dreams, then they would often not go to war or change their plans. So they were shaped by their cultural beliefs in their decisions to go to war or to not go to war.
It sounds like prior to the French and Indian War, the Cherokee and Anglos in both Virginia and South Carolina were on friendly terms. I mean, the Cherokee went into the French and Indian War as allies of the British. So what happened? What soured relations? Would you tell us about the 1758 British campaign against French Fort Duquesne?
Sure. So both Virginia and South Carolina had wanted Cherokee assistance, and it turns out that Cherokees ended up going to participate in the British campaigns against Fort Duquesne. And in 1758, about 700 or 800 Cherokees made that trip. And they tired of waiting. That campaign was incredibly slow. It had, 10,000 troops traveling from Philadelphia to what is today Pittsburgh. And so although Cherokees were scouting and skirmishing and getting intelligence on French positions, and even going to some of the other French forts, in the Great Lakes region. The slow pace of the campaign really led many to grow tired and impatient. They had to get home because they had to get home for the fall green corn harvest festival. They had to get home for the winter hunts because their families' livelihoods depended upon it. And so many of them left early. And when they returned back to Cherokee country, they were attacked by Virginia frontier settlers. The Virginia frontiers people had been through Shawnee Indian raids, and many may have tried to collect the Cherokee scalps to collect the bounty that Virginia was offering. Many may have just simply seen all Indians as alike and indiscriminately fired or indiscriminately wanted to kill them. But that sowed tremendous grief in the Cherokee people, who felt that they had been disrespected, who felt that they also had to avenge the deaths of their loved ones. About 36 or more Cherokees were killed, and that sparked a series of Cherokee retaliatory raids and attacks over the next year on the South Carolina and North Carolina frontier, which was closer than Virginia.
Who are the Cherokee fighting? Are they fighting like the equivalent of the South Carolina militia, or are they fighting against the regular British Army?
Well, here's where it gets interesting. So after these series of raids in 1759, South Carolina's governor took the lead to try to negotiate an end. They were, at the time, the Cherokees were simply attacking frontier settlements on the outskirts of North Carolina and South Carolina, but it was South Carolina militia who in 1759 seized Cherokee diplomats hostage and marched them back to a fort on the South Carolina frontier. So that was militia. North Carolina troops never arrived in time, and the hostages were confined in a small hut. A bunch of them died of smallpox, and the Cherokees were forced to sign a treaty that they soon broke. That then led to a series of Cherokee raids on the South Carolina frontier and North Carolina frontier. And in 1760, General Amherst sent British troops to try to put this Cherokee uprising down. And Cherokees defeated that army, primarily British troops. They were primarily Scottish Highlanders and some Royal Scots who had seen action further to the north and were pretty much done with that. So in 1760, it was primarily British troops. The Cherokees then seized Fort Loudon, and it looked like peace could have been concluded, war could have ended at that point, but the British decided to send a retaliatory and really punitive expedition the following year, and that featured a very large number of South Carolina provincial forces with it. Provincial forces like Francis Marion as a younger man, Andrew Pickens as a younger man, these people that would later gain fame as South Carolina patriots.
I asked about the militia versus the regular army because as you were describing the slow campaign of 1758 to Fort Duquesne, it sounds like the Native Americans and the militia actually have a lot in common, because one of the knocks that the British Army gives to the militia is that the militiamen always want to go home. It's time to bring in the crops. And that seems to be what the Cherokee are doing too. It's time to go in for the hunt, to take care of the family. Of course, we don't want to be at war.
That's a great point. I mean, certainly when they were allies, they had a lot in common. And Cherokees and militia or provincial forces often work together in those campaigns. The Fort Duquesne campaign, for example, they often work together scouting and skirmishing, and many Virginians in particular learned their guerrilla warfare tactics and things like that from the Cherokees. The Cherokees were, we probably don't realize, training Virginian and Pennsylvanian forces in the French and Indian War.
Let's now look at a few of the characters that are involved in the Anglo-Cherokee Wars, the people that try to break peace and wage war. One person that keeps appearing throughout Carolina in Crisis is Attakulla Kulla. Would you tell us about Attakulla Kulla and the role he played in the Anglo-Cherokee War?
Sure. He was also known as the Little Carpenter, known for his ability to build peace and consensus. And he was the Cherokee voice of peace during these years. He was a steadfast ally of the British, and that dated back to his trip to England in 1730 as a young man. He was also the father of Dragging Canoe, who would split with his own father and would be the leader of the Cherokee resistance movement in the Revolution, the Chickamauga Cherokees. But back to the little carpenter, he was short-statured, slim, charismatic, mild-mannered, had a warm smile and a real soft face, and everybody that saw him really learned to respect him. In some ways, you feel bad for him because he had a very difficult job. He had these decentralized villages that he was trying to get on the same page. He also had and was really responsible for creating that hostage crisis of 1759 to 60. And in many ways, he was blamed by both Cherokees and skeptical South Carolinians for the 1761 treaty and how it unfolded.
Do you think he was really to blame? Was the evidence there to support his blame, or did he become a scapegoat for his people to put blame on?
I think in all cases he became a scapegoat because I think he was simply doing the best that he could with the circumstances. He looked to the future and really thought that the Cherokees could not win and that the best way to ensure their economic survival and really maybe their survival was to side with the British and to promote peace as much as possible. Some people say that that was because that was his political role in society, and some people are kind of see that more through a cultural lens, but I just simply see that as more of a pragmatic lens. And pair that with the rivalry between him and Conestoga, the great warrior, the war chief from the Overhills who had never lost a man in battle in his entire military career. He would be the person that would try to liberate the hostages at Fort Prince George, that would be the voice of war and try to go back to French New Orleans or other French forts and try to get French assistance, which never seemed to be forthcoming. But one should probably see Attakullakulla in a more forgiving light.
On the Carolinian side, William Henry Littleton played a central role in Anglo-Cherokee relations and in the Anglo-Cherokee War. Would you tell us about William Henry Littleton?
Sure. William Henry Littleton was the appointed royal governor of South Carolina from 1756 to 1760, and he really escalated the Cherokee conflict by miscalculating and overreaching in 1759 when he was trying to put an end to the Cherokee retaliatory assaults on the frontier. He's the governor who had ordered the seizing of the Cherokee diplomats and marched the militiamen to the Cherokee country. So he really created a more serious situation than was probably necessary. He's a person that I think is real fascinating because he was just in his late 20s at the time, and he had left his brother's housekeeper pregnant in England to assume the governorship of South Carolina. He was a bachelor, and when he arrived in South Carolina, there was a lot of hope and enthusiasm that he could guide South Carolina through what was appearing to be a pretty difficult time. But Governor Littleton, I think, was simply in over his head and made some miscalculations and really is responsible for the escalation of the Anglo-Cherokee War. And there'd be other governors, and none of them were too popular. It's kind of a tough job being a colonial governor because pretty much no matter what you do, people don't like you, and it's hard to get the assembly to go along with what the crown wants you to encourage. But Governor Littleton, I think, bears a good bit of blame for the Anglo-Cherokee War escalating to the extent that it did. Although he left before the second campaign started, the 1760 campaign, he's really responsible for the war's escalation.
It seems like between 1759 and 1761, there's a lot of animosity between the Cherokee and the South Carolinians. How did all of this resolve? I have to imagine there must have been challenges that both sides faced as they attempt to obtain a peace.
Yes, I think after the Cherokees seized Fort Loudon in 1760, a lot of Cherokees wanted peace, and they actually approached Virginia, the Virginia frontier, where a military expedition was underway, to assist, but it never got there. But they made their way to the Virginia frontier, where they met with Colonel William Byrd III and proposed peace. But General Amherst did not want a peace to be made that way, and instead sent the retaliatory expedition, which was led by Lieutenant Colonel James Grant. And so for peace to really happen, these British and South Carolina provincials had to burn and destroy Cherokee country first. That was the orders that they had. I don't think it was necessary, but those are certainly the orders that they had from Amherst. And so it took the destruction of probably half of Cherokee villages for Cherokees led by Attakullakulla to negotiate for peace. And as that peace process and as those negotiations played out, tensions were further exposed and widened between South Carolina elites and British officers and British officials. These three campaigns, particularly the last two, had sparked all sorts of controversy, as you might expect. South Carolinian officers thought that British officers were disrespecting them. South Carolina politicians thought that they were being expected to pass and saddle very high tax burdens, which is true. They also had blamed the British for not doing enough or not doing the right thing or not being genocidal enough, if you will. And so people like Christopher Gadsden, who would later lead the Stamp Act response and who would later become a leading South Carolina patriot, Christopher Gadsden really became the spokesperson throughout that process, calling for a real hard line against the Cherokees and using every opportunity he could to criticize the way that the British had handled the war and prosecuted the war. And in fact, it got so bad while this peace process was playing out, it got so bad that the day after the treaty was signed, South Carolina's provincial commander and Lieutenant Colonel James Grant, the British commander, fought a duel in Charleston, and both lived.
Did the peace treaty favor one side or the other more?
Well, Cherokees were forced to accept a really brutal peace treaty. A lot of the terms were not enforceable, but many of them were. It resulted in the taking of Cherokee lands. It resulted in the British claiming the right to man forts in the Cherokee country. It resulted in really a formal acknowledgement of Cherokee defeat. And it led many Cherokees to point fingers at each other. It also really was a reminder that Cherokee society and Cherokee population had plummeted so dramatically. I think about a third of Cherokees were killed from war and disease during just a few years. And so Cherokees were really left, as a result of that treaty and as a result of the war and the disease that preceded it, they were left in a vulnerable position, vulnerable to attacks from Indians to the north, their enemies, vulnerable to Virginia and South Carolina and North Carolina settlers who were overrunning their lands illegally, even despite the treaty. And it left them, in many ways, forced to adopt a defensive position that would only leave their situation worse on the eve of the Revolution.
As different as Native American peoples throughout the North American continent are, one constant, one thing they all have in common is every time they sign a treaty with Anglo-Americans, they have to give up land.
Yes, and that was certainly the case here in this treaty, and that would only escalate throughout the 1760s and 1770s.
Were the Cherokees bitter about this land secession? How did they deal with it?
Well, I think in some ways, yes, but I think their biggest concern, losing the land, that affected the lower towns, the ones in what is today northwestern South Carolina, that affected those the worst. And they were more concerned that the loss of their lands meant a loss of hunting grounds. And so they couldn't support their traditional way of life and their economic survival to the same extent without those hunting grounds and without those lands. So those were the ones that were especially concerned, the lower townspeople, and they'd even proposed a few creative solutions, like a joint hunting preserve that whites and Cherokees could use in common. And of course, whites rejected that idea as something that they wouldn't do at that time. But yeah, it especially affected the lower towns, and their demise was hastened as a result of the treaty.
I know we shouldn't look at the colonial period as a lead up to the American Revolution, but one of the things that happens after the French and Indian War is the American Revolution. And I wonder, Did this harsh treaty affect the way that the Cherokees would get involved with the American Revolution and its war for independence?
Well, I think in many regards, the Cherokees came to see the British as the best option they had. And this goes back to the treaty and to the aftermath of that treaty. South Carolinians couldn't really be trusted because their settlers were overrunning the lands. The British at least tried to hold back settlement. And as the 1760s and 1770s unfolded, Cherokees often found at least a sympathetic ear in Britain. And so I think it's 1762, Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, who's actually from Virginia, he and another Virginian officer named Henry Timberlake led a small Cherokee delegation to England. And British authorities kind of patched things up with the Cherokees at that point. And so from that point on, I would argue, Cherokees saw the British as really the best hope they had. You know, the French were defeated and the French would soon evacuate, so they didn't have them to help. The Spanish were not really very much of a presence in the Southeast yet. And so most Cherokees then saw Britain as really their best option. And when the revolution broke out, the British were a more appealing choice with as far as whom they should side with.
One aspect of the Anglo-Cherokee War that we haven't discussed that does play a big role in Carolina in Crisis is how African Americans saw opportunities in the war to advance their cause and break free from slavery. Daniel, would you tell us about how African Americans used and viewed the Anglo-Cherokee War?
Well, in many ways, they saw challenges because the diseases that were spread as a result of the war affected their lives disproportionately. But in many ways, they also found opportunities. I noticed that the number of runaway slaves dramatically increased during the course of the war. And I looked at runaway slave ads, and I saw that those numbers just about doubled from 1759 to 1761. Some slaves found opportunities fighting in provincial or militia armies, and some of them actually ran away from their plantations to do so, probably looking for the adventure, the opportunity, and possibly even the wages that they could be offered, and they were paid as well. Some slaves, like Abram the messenger, became free as a result of their service, although that was extremely uncommon. I think really he's the only one, and you'll read about him in Carolina in Crisis. So there were opportunities for some. There was also opportunities, or at least to plan and plot and consider a larger scale revolt, which is indeed what happened when the war first began.
We've just scratched the surface of the Anglo-Cherokee War, and as we mentioned at the beginning, this is really an understudied aspect of the French and Indian War. For those of us who would like to learn more about the war, are there any historic sites we can visit or other books we can read about it?
Sure. I would highly recommend that if anybody is in Tennessee, they should definitely visit Fort Loudoun State Historic Area in Von Orr, Tennessee. It is an amazing place. It has a recently redone museum. The fort has been reconstructed, and it's really excellent. So I would definitely add that to your list of places to visit if you want to learn more about it. There have been some other books written about this subject, and I'd recommend, in addition to Carolina in Crisis, for a book that looks more at the political and diplomatic and military aspects, you could look at John Oliphant's book, Peace and War on the Anglo-Cherokee Frontier, or for more on Cherokee culture, The Dividing Paths by Tom Hatley. Those are other books to look at.
Thank you for those recommendations. Now we must move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Daniel, in your opinion, what might have happened if African American slaves had found a way to join the Cherokee in their war against South Carolina?
You definitely see a pretty uncontrollable situation there. If they had worked in conjunction with Cherokee attacks and had launched an uprising like they planned in 1759, then it would have put the Low Country into turmoil, if slaves had escaped to the mountains where they could have joined with Cherokees there, they might have established colonies or maroon colonies like in Jamaica at the very same time and elsewhere, and they would have posed, in any event, a significant military and economic threat to South Carolina, possibly for years to come. This is what South Carolina's governor during 1760 to 61 was afraid of, Lieutenant Governor William Ball, and this is what he feared, and he in fact ordered the press to not report on the extent of the slave plots for fear of what might happen. So if they had worked in conjunction with the Cherokees, or if they had fled and joined the Cherokees, it would have been devastating, and it certainly also would have resulted in more British troops in South Carolina, which of course would have created turmoil between South Carolinians and British forces.
Daniel, what overlooked aspect of the American Revolution or Native American experiences are you researching and writing about now?
Well, I'm looking at Wabanaki Indians of the northern borderlands, Penobscot and Passamaquoddy and other peoples during the Revolutionary War. And I'm looking at how they experienced and shaped the Revolutionary era. And that's part of my ongoing research on Indian patriots of the American Revolution more generally. It
wasn't just inspired that you now work at Colby College in Maine?
That's part of it, because I became more interested as I've been here. But as I said, I'm also a New England native, so it's something that holds interest for me anyway.
And where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
You can find me and connect with me on LinkedIn, Daniel J. Tortora, Tortora. You can email me at dtortora@colby.edu. You can also check my Amazon author page to see where I'll be speaking or signing books in 2015 and 2016 and beyond.
Thank you for bringing us this overlooked aspect of the French and Indian War.
Thank you for having me.
As Daniel acknowledged, the Anglo-Cherokee War stands as an understudied area of early American history. But after our conversation, I'm not sure if it should remain understudied. The war provides a window into Anglo-Cherokee relations, and it also reveals how British officials, Anglo-American colonists, and Native American peoples went about negotiating cultural differences and misunderstandings. As Daniel described for us, most of the time, none of these parties saw eye to eye on how to settle their disputes. Study of the Anglo-Cherokee War is also important because the war influenced Cherokee views during the American Revolution. British officials negotiated the peace that ended the war, but as lopsided as that peace agreement was, many Cherokee viewed the actions and attitudes of their Anglo-American neighbors to be more untrustworthy and egregious than those of the British. Hence why the Cherokee sided with the British during the American War for Independence. And this decision had huge implications for the American war effort in the Southeast. If you would like to know more about the American War for Independence and how it played out in the Southeast and along the Gulf Coast, you should listen to episode 37 with Kathleen Duvall. You can find more information about Daniel, his book, Carolina in Crisis, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/056. Did you know that Ben Franklin's World was part of a movement to help restore history to the forefront of the public mind? If you would like to become involved with this movement, or if you loved the show and would like to find out more about how you can support it, text Support BF World to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement. While you're there, make sure that you catch the behind-the-scenes video for how I make the show. I promise you, my bobblehead collection alone will make that video worth it. If you love history and would like to meet other people who love history too, you should join Poor Richard's Club, our listener community on Facebook. To join the club, text BF World to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com and sign up for the Franklin Gazette. Finally, what early American historical events do you think are understudied? Email your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in Poor Richard's Club.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.